In recent hours, global capitals have literally frozen after a sharp and demonstrative statement by Donald Trump, which, according to observers, became one of the toughest and most blunt signals toward Iran during the entire current escalation. This is not just about political pressure or another rhetorical threat. In expert circles, the statement is viewed as an open ultimatum backed by real military movement. According to Trump, a huge armada, the largest in recent times, is heading toward Iran, led by the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, and in scale, it exceeds even the grouping previously involved in the operation off the coast of Venezuela. Such wording leaves no room for diplomatic interpretation. It is the language of force aimed both at Tehran and at the domestic U.S. audience, as well as allies and adversaries worldwide. Analysts note that Trump is deliberately using the harshest possible tone, appealing to speed, determination, and readiness to carry out the mission if Iran does not make concessions. At the same time, the key element of the statement is not so much the threat of a strike as the attempt to shift responsibility for possible escalation onto Iran itself, emphasizing that time is decisive and that an exit is still possible through negotiations and abandonment of the nuclear program. However, in Tehran, such statements are perceived not as an invitation to dialogue, but as direct pressure bordering on blackmail. Experts stress that the mention of the Operation Midnight Hammer and the phrase that the next attack will be much worse are not a random choice of words, but a carefully calibrated psychological technique designed to demonstrate that the US has allegedly already crossed this line and is ready to do so again on a far more destructive scale. It is important to note that official US structures do not confirm the details of such operations, which adds an extra layer of uncertainty and amplifies the threatening effect. Military analysts point out that the very mention of a specific aircraft carrier and the comparison of the current grouping with the Venezuelan campaign is a signal not only to Iran, but also to other global players, primarily China and Russia. It is a demonstration that the US is prepared to use force in several regions simultaneously and does not consider itself bound by previous constraints. Yet behind the outward bravado lies a far more complex reality. According to sources, there is no full consensus within the American establishment regarding further steps. Some military officials and politicians fear that even a limited operation against Iran could escalate into a prolonged conflict with unpredictable consequences for the entire Middle East. Iran, for its part, is not remaining a passive observer. According to regional analysts, Tehran has already placed part of its forces on heightened alert, activated air defense systems, and strengthened control over strategic facilities. At the same time, Iranian rhetoric remains restrained, which experts see as a deliberate tactic, not to give the US a formal pretext for an immediate strike while simultaneously preparing for the worst-case scenario. A crucial factor in this configuration is the role of China and Russia. According to insiders, Beijing is closely tracking the movement of American forces and intensifying diplomatic contacts with Iran, emphasizing the need for restraint while continuing economic and technological support. For China, an open conflict between the US and Iran is advantageous only in one sense. It distracts Washington from the Asian direction, but at the same time, it carries serious risks for the global economy and energy markets. Russia, in turn, according to analysts, views what is happening as another stage in the dismantling of the old system of international relations, where threats and ultimatums increasingly replace diplomatic mechanisms. Moscow publicly calls for de-escalation, but behind the scenes, according to sources, it is actively preparing for any development of events, strengthening coordination with partners, and analyzing possible consequences for regional security. In this context, Trump's statement becomes not just an episode of information warfare, but a symbol of a new reality in which major powers increasingly speak the language of force, even while formally keeping the door to negotiations open. Experts emphasize that such a strategy is dangerous because it sharply narrows the space for compromise. Any retreat can be perceived as weakness, and any action as a pretext for further escalation. For Iran, this moment becomes a test of endurance and strategic thinking. To concede means to acknowledge pressure. To resist means to risk a large-scale conflict. For the US, it is an attempt to regain lost initiative, and demonstrate that Washington is still capable of dictating terms. However, in a changed world where the influence of alternative centers of power is growing, such ultimatums may produce the opposite effect from what is intended. An increasing number of analysts agree that the current crisis around Iran is not merely a dispute over the nuclear program, but a clash of approaches to the world order, and how it is resolved will send a signal to all other regions where tensions have already reached critical levels. The world is entering a phase in which each such statement can become either the beginning of negotiations or the first step toward events that diplomacy will no longer be able to stop. Against this backdrop, more and more observers note that the key intrigue of the current crisis lies not in the mere fact of the movement of American forces, but in how all other players respond to this signal. In Tehran, it is well understood that a direct response to Trump's ultimatum could be used as a formal pretext for a strike, so Iran's strategy is now built around waiting and demonstrating readiness for negotiations without real concessions. This is a delicate balance in which every statement and every gesture is carefully calibrated. At the same time, an information campaign is intensifying, aimed at the domestic audience and regional allies, to show that Iran is neither intimidated nor isolated. Experts stress that it is precisely now that it will be decided whether this armada becomes an instrument of pressure or a real harbinger of military action. For the US, backing down without a visible result would mean a loss of face after such loud statements, while for Iran, concessions under the threat of force could create a dangerous precedent for years ahead. China and Russia, according to analysts, will seek to keep the situation in a suspended state, in which the conflict does not turn into open war, but is also not resolved quickly. Such a scenario is strategically beneficial for them, as it ties down Washington's resources and reinforces the sense of instability in the old world order. As a result, the world finds itself at a point where no side wants to take the first step toward escalation, but none is ready to retreat. It is precisely at such moments, experts note, that history most often makes sharp turns, either toward an unexpected compromise or toward events that can no longer be controlled by statements and ultimatums. That is precisely why the coming days and even hours are being viewed by analysts as critical. Everything now depends on which signal is sent first, not in words, but in practice. Any change in a fleet route, any sudden exercise, any intelligence leak can instantly alter the balance and trigger a chain reaction. At this point, the world has effectively held its breath because the stakes are too high and the margin for error is minimal. The United States is demonstrating resolve, Iran is waiting, China and Russia are engaging in cold calculation. And if in the past such crises could be diffused behind closed doors, today, in an era of public ultimatums and demonstrative shows of force, the price of a single wrong move may prove far too high. That is why the current moment is already being described not simply as another escalation, but as a test of the entire global security system, a test whose outcome will determine what the next stage of global history will be like.